Hey, welcome back. I'm Kight. Thanks for coming back to the channel. This is where we help people and teams build the discipline they need to get what they want as fast as possible. And this is another discipline guide. Today, we're going to talk all about feedback, about giving feedback. Because eventually, you need to give feedback to people. You've given feedback to somebody. You need to give feedback to somebody. You want to give feedback to somebody. And that's obviously why you're here, why you're watching this, what got your attention. And when you give feedback, you want to do it well. You want to be confident both in yourself and you want to be confident in the other person receiving the feedback as you intend it with what it is that you want to accomplish by giving that feedback. And so the discipline guide to feedback, there's 6 things I want to talk about. 6 core, simple things that you can start doing right away and you can bring and implement and apply to the next moment that you give feedback, whether it be personally or professionally, somebody you know well or not very well, somebody where you have deep emotions around an emotional topic, or whether it's just something kind of black and white that you need somebody to get or understand or you want to communicate or get across. And feedback spans a whole range of ways that we need to deliver it, ways that we can deliver it, and people that we need to deliver it to. Because you've probably had the experience, I know that I have, of getting feedback from somebody that just didn't go very well. And there's all the different ways that people give feedback, and there's all kinds of techniques, and I'm not going to talk about techniques today. I want to make sure you have a bunch of paths that you can follow. You can bring your own approach to the feedback, but you have some simple standards, some simple disciplines that you can follow. Let's just talk about 6 of them. The first one, the first discipline for giving feedback and doing it well is to make sure you have a target objective in mind when you go into giving feedback. What do you actually want? I mean, there's a number of things that you could choose, and what matters is that you identify it. Right? You could establish, I just want them to hear me. You could establish, I want them to change something very specific, and the goal is you need them to change. You could establish, I want them to understand where I'm coming from. Not necessarily agree with me, but I want them to at least understand, and I can accept the disagreement as long as they understand where I'm coming from. You could have a hard and fast standard of they need to make this change, stop this behavior, and do this thing instead, and they need the feedback that is unacceptable. I don't know what the target objective is, and it'll change by context and person. What matters is not that I know it, it's that you choose what objective you want going into the feedback. I think a lot of people get sideways in the middle of feedback because they don't actually have a target objective. When they don't have a target objective, they get halfway into giving the feedback, or they're in the middle of getting it out, or the person disagrees with them, the emotions crank up, a person gets lost, and that's how arguments get started, or things don't get shared that need to actually be shared. So the first thing is choose your target objective for why you're giving the feedback and what outcome you actually want. The second piece is identify and acknowledge your own emotions. Everybody has some kind of emotional state. They have some kind of feeling about giving feedback. And again, it changes based on context and person. But going into a moment, going into a conversation of giving feedback, you have some emotions. They're either high or low. They're either, positive or negative. They are very aligned and smooth, or they're kind of disruptive. They have you excited and confident and feeling good. They have you feeling a little nervous and anxious or afraid. So when you're going to give the feedback, acknowledge what your emotions are. Because when you acknowledge your emotions, first, you put yourself in a situation of self-awareness and you help yourself gain more self-control. And 2 is it allows you to actually express that to the person. If you don't have a ton of emotions around a topic, you can communicate calmly and say, listen, I don't have a ton of strong feelings about this. This is very straightforward for me. And so there's not a whole lot of emotional component to this. If you're feeling nervous and anxious about giving the feedback, you can tell them. You can say, listen, I'm a little afraid to tell you this. I'm feeling a little anxious at even communicating this to you, and so I'm afraid this conversation won't go well, and so I might be hesitant to share this feedback, but I'm going to anyway despite how I feel. I think when we're in these situations, I think people will naturally empathize with you more if you acknowledge and express what you're actually feeling, I think that draws people to you. It's a little bit more vulnerability that doesn't expose you to be undermined. It actually positions you for somebody to come closer to you. So the second piece is acknowledge and accept or appreciate what emotions you're actually feeling. The third piece is to tell the truth and a fuller version of it. A lot of times when we give feedback, we tell one piece. We get so fixated and focused on the one single thing we want the person to get or understand or do or change or not do, whatever it is. We get so fixated on it that we forget everything else that is encompassed in the truth. For example, if you need to give somebody feedback about a piece of their behavior, something they said or did or didn't say or didn't do that was negative in consequence or impact or experience to somebody else, the natural inclination is to communicate feedback about that one negative thing, blow it up into something really big, and then not acknowledge the 80 or 90% of the other good things that that person does or the other impact they have or the rest of the scenario, again, the larger context. So this third piece, this is really big. It's tell the truth and a fuller version of it. If there's something you don't like about what a person is doing, we can pick a scenario. Let's say you need to tell somebody in your family that the way they're acting in a certain way, something they're doing is kind of disruptive for the family in some way. Right? A fuller version of the truth is that that member of your family is a good person, does a ton of good things, you love them, they're awesome a ton of the time, but there's this one thing they do that you really don't like and it's really disruptive and it's making a lot of people upset. So a fuller version of the truth is, hey, you're awesome and you're wonderful, but when you do this, it kind of sucks for us and the other people around. It's not the only thing and we can get over it, but we'd rather not. Okay? And you can keep doing that. It's totally your choice, but we don't like it. And when you do it, you'll know that we don't like that and it'll be really awkward for all of us. And I think that we would want to enjoy each other rather than have that thing happen. So my request to you would be, can you pay attention to that? And can you work hard to not do that if it's not that important to you? Because it's kind of disruptive to the rest of us. Doesn't mean that I don't like you. It doesn't mean that 90% of the other things that you do aren't amazing. There's just this one thing. Right? That's a fuller version of the truth. And you'll notice even in hearing that, it's a lot more open and receptive for somebody to make a change, or at least to consider making a change, which is a step in the right direction when you give feedback, when we tell a fuller version of the truth. Because that person sees all of their behavior, not just this one thing. To fixate and focus only on the one thing we're giving feedback on without setting it in the larger context and the larger behavior patterns of the other person is to miss that fuller version of the truth, which often undermines how your feedback gets received. So make sure you're telling the truth and a fuller version of it. Do not, before you go to the next one, do not miss out or minimize the first portion of this. Tell the truth. So many times in feedback, people soften or tweak or only tell a piece. They don't actually express the full, real feedback they want to get across. They get nervous at the last second and they don't tell the whole truth of the feedback, and then they don't tell the fuller version of it to paint this whole picture. So the first component, the first element of that is tell the truth. That's the commitment. Okay? And that helps if you've done number one, which is establish and clarify and choose the real objective that you want. Now you're in a position to say, all right, well, what truth do I need to get across? And how do I tell a fuller version of it? The fourth piece comes right in from the third one, and that is allow people space and freedom to experience their own emotions. If there was one piece of feedback, if this was the discipline guide to giving feedback and I was only allowed to communicate one piece, it would be stop trying to control the other person's emotions when you give feedback. The number one reason why people don't give feedback more often and in more real ways is they're too nervous and afraid about how people will react and respond and what will happen to the relationship. They think people are going to get their feelings hurt. They think that they can't handle it emotionally. They think they're going to upset. They think they're going to, the relationship is going to break down, whatever it happens to be. Look, if you're going to give feedback to somebody, then you have to acknowledge that they are a human being who makes their own choices, has their own opinions, has their own perspectives, and has their own control over themselves. It's not on you to control and dictate the emotions that they feel based on what you say. That's their call. So if you're going to give somebody feedback, give them space and freedom to have their own emotions. They might be upset, they might be pissed off, they might be hurt, they might be a little stung, they might be surprised, they might be any number of things. The point is, what you control is how you get that feedback across, how you deliver it. What you don't control is how somebody processes it and what they feel. So if you give feedback, you have to understand that their emotions are not your job. That's their job. You focus on delivering feedback the way that you intend, with the objective that you're going after, acknowledging your own emotions, and trying to paint a full picture of the truth as best as you possibly can. They will feel what they feel, and you can move from there. But it's okay if somebody feels something in the midst of feedback. That's not just normal, it's expected. So don't try to engineer that. Go in being the person that you want to be, and then let the person feel the way they need to feel, and you can move forward in the conversation. The fifth piece is own your opinions and assumptions. While you give feedback, you have opinions that your feedback is based on. You have assumptions, you have observations, you have your own experience. Own all of those things. Right? Acknowledge those things. Express those things to somebody. Separate between a fact and an opinion. Separate between something that is absolute, that everyone agrees on, and something that's an assumption that you have inside your head. A lot of times in the midst of feedback, what gets people in trouble is they confuse their opinions with facts. They confuse their assumptions with something that is objectively what everyone would agree on. They watch somebody's behavior, they see what somebody does, make an assumption about why they did it, and then give feedback thinking that their assumption was reality. Don't do that. Right? Own where your opinions and your assumptions are. And this requires self-awareness on your part. This requires you to acknowledge, hey, I watched you do this, I saw this happen, and it felt to me like this was what was going on and this is where it came from. But that's what I observed, not necessarily what actually happened. It was an assumption I made based on what I observed. So, this is what I thought happened, and here's how I felt about it. Is that what actually happened? No, how did you see it? What happened here? What happens is when you own your opinions, you own your assumptions, you allow the other person to show you what their opinions and their assumptions are, and a lot of times, the reality in what actually happened is somewhere in the middle. Or sometimes your initial opinions and assumptions weren't quite on target. And through owning those things, you express to the person by giving feedback, you learn where your assumptions and where your opinions were off target, and you save yourself from making a big mistake. Or other times, you save the other person from making a big mistake because your opinions and assumptions were maybe not perfectly accurate, but they were moving in the right direction, and you can really help somebody. If you don't own your opinions and assumptions, the big mistake that you run is you treat your opinions as facts, and you completely kill and undermine your credibility to give feedback that anybody else will hear. Because if you express an opinion and you treat it as a fact that the other person knows is not real, they shut down all of your feedback, and you make it much harder for yourself to give feedback in the future because now you lack credibility. If you don't want to own your opinions and assumptions, it's better to just not give the feedback and deal with your own emotions about what you think yourself than it is to go in confusing your opinions for facts. The sixth and final piece that I want to share with you today on the discipline guide to giving feedback is to establish clarity piece by piece. Obviously we want to end in clarity, right? We want to end when we give feedback with clarity about what we spoke about, what we communicated, what the other person understands, what you understand, and what are we going to do from this point moving forward. We obviously want to end in that spot. And how we get to that place, and we'll come back to, all right, how do we end with clarity? But how we get to that place is establish clarity piece by piece. A lot of times during a feedback session, during a feedback moment, during a feedback conversation, again, if it's a feedback session, right, we're talking about a professional version most likely. If it's a conversation that involves feedback. It might be personal, or it might be an unplanned professional one where we're just having a dialogue. But a lot of times what will happen during this process, this conversation of feedback, is the feedback gets shared, and then there's some back and forth, and then there's some, whether it's discussion or debate or exchanging of opinions, and things will accelerate very quickly. A lot of things will be put on the table, some facts, some opinions, some assumptions, some stories, some emotions, and before we know it, we've kind of got this, we've got this big mess of stuff all on the table, and it's really hard because everybody is hooked on to whatever it is they're personally attached to as their biggest priority in that moment. And it gets very difficult to get our arms around. So again, and this is also very helpful, by the way, when you're getting feedback. You can apply this piece by piece clarity, but it particularly applies when you're giving it. So as the conversation unfolds, make sure that before you move on to the next piece, or if a bunch of different elements and factors get thrown in, make sure you go back, right, and establish clarity on the first step. Establish clarity on the first piece. And clarity is not agreement, it's clarity. Okay, so it would sound like this. If I was giving feedback to somebody, I would say, all right, hey, I need to share an observation that I have with you of what I saw, and then what I thought happened when I saw that, and what I think and what I feel needs to be done. And I just want to make sure you hear this. Before you agree or disagree, I just want to establish that, and I want to make sure that we get clarity on what it is that I'm communicating. And I would say, all right, here's what I saw, and then here's what I think about that, and maybe here's what I think needs to be done. And I'll say, does that make sense? And I'll check and see first if that makes sense with the other person. And they'll say yes or no or kind of or yes but, and then they'll go in the piece. And then I'll say, all right, well let me at least make sure that we're clear, right? This happened, this is what happened, yes? Great. And let's first, are we on the same page? Are we clear about what actually happened? Because if I missed a piece, I want to know. If they didn't think I knew all of that, I want to make sure that they know that. And we establish clarity on what actually happened. Okay, cool. Then we can establish clarity on, hey, here's what I think about that. And here's where you need to separate clarity from agreement. When I'm communicating what I think about that, what I need them to be clear about is not that they think the same things about that. They need to be clear on knowing I think this, all right? So if you said blank, we agree that, all right, yes, you did in fact say that. Now I need to establish clarity. Do you understand that I think that was the wrong thing to say, right? Do you get that? Okay, yeah. So you're clear that I disagree with the path that you chose to take on how you spoke that and what you said. Do you get that I didn't agree with that and that I don't approve of that? Yeah, you do. Okay, great. Now we can move to, all right, let me tell you what I think the implications are of that, the consequences or impact or whatever it is, and then you establish that. The first piece, we're going to agree and get clarity on what actually happened. From there, clarity does not require agreement. What it matters, right, what it requires is, does the other person have clarity on what you think, why you think it, and what you believe the implications to be? From that point, you can have a discussion about what to do, whether they want to agree with you or don't want to agree with you, whether they're considerate, and this is where your objectives come into play. So if you establish clarity piece by piece, then what you're doing is think of it as building blocks of clarity, okay? Building block, what happened? Building block, what did I think about that? Building block, what did I feel about that? Or how did it make somebody else feel? Building block, what were the implications or consequences of that? Building block, what do we need to do instead? Piece by piece by piece. Then at the end of the conversation, it puts you in a great place to have, all right, let's walk out of this conversation with some clarity on what you think, what I think, and what we're going to agree to do about this conversation that we just had. And this is where your objective comes into play. And now we've come full circle. So that's what I believe to be the best starting point, right? It's obviously, it's not a bunch of tactics. It's not a bunch of really specific pieces. It's definitely not the sandwich technique of giving feedback, which I don't think anybody actually enjoys having done to them, where we know we're just telling them two positive things so we can get that one criticism across. This is a discipline guide. This is helping provide you a structure, and you can apply 1, 2, 3, or all 6 of these elements to giving feedback. And if you do, I bet your feedback And both giving and receiving is going to go a lot better the more discipline that you bring to it. Thanks for watching this video. If you haven't, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can see every discipline guide that comes out. Click the bell for notifications. Click the buttons that make the most possible sense for you. If you want to get updates, you know what to do, you know how to do it. Quick question for you. Two things, actually two questions. Number one, when you struggle to give or receive feedback, where do you struggle? What have been your sticking points? Throw it down in the comments. What are your struggles to give or receive feedback? Why is it difficult? And then the second question is, if you try any number of these steps on the discipline guide to giving feedback, share down in the comments what worked, what didn't, where did you find a sticking point actually trying some of these things to bring this kind of discipline to giving feedback. So where do you struggle to give or receive feedback? Why do you think it's so hard so often for you or for somebody else if you've had the experience and the observation? And number two is, if you've tried these things we've talked about in this video, how did it go for you? What worked well, what didn't? What was kind of okay, and where was it kind of messy and sticky? So again, thank you for watching. I appreciate you. Jump down in the comments, give us some feedback.